everybody, and welcome back to the channel. It's your girl Lori, and I want to talk to you about Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story that is on Netflix. And people have asked me left and right, what do I think of it? I love it. I think that, Evan Peters deserves 7 million awards. I think he did so well. I think Niecy Nash did great. I think the whole cast did such a great job. But I know a lot of people were asking me in general, what do I think of Jeffrey Dahmer? And a lot of you know that I've studied psychopaths and sociopaths, why the brain does what it does, nature versus nurture, and everything in between. And it's interesting too, and I'll get into it in a minute, on why there seems to be such an uproar with this specific Jeffrey Dahmer show, because it's not the first one. He's not the first person to play Jeffrey Dahmer, right? And it's not like out of the blue. Like, we've known the story on Jeffrey Dahmer. But because it's like one of the most #1 rated shows on, and has been on Netflix for some time, right? Because of that, there's a lot more optic to it. Like, there's a lot more people on top of it. There's a lot of complaints. You're seeing people reach out to things. This is not the first time that it happened. I'm not being insensitive. I'm just trying to explain to you how the world works and why we do the things we do with our brain. So I just got asked this on a live, and they said, he's such a monster. Yes, his actions were definitely not human. Okay, like, if you want to go by that. I look at things differently. Okay, this is not to diminish how the victims are, by all means, nothing like that at all. I look at it, though, from a whole different viewpoint, and look at it from the mental health perspective. If, in fact, this show is somewhat true to nature, and by all accounts, there's been a level of that where, he was kind of like, hey, there's something off with me, right? And I don't mean your typical intrusive thoughts, because sometimes people have intrusive thoughts. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're going to become a serial killer. It's not at all what that means. It's just an intrusive thought. His was a little different because he had this appetite for it, and it didn't make sense. And honestly, there were a few times that I do believe he was kind of like, hey man, like, there's a little something off. And everybody, especially the time. So think of the time and error. If that would be now, which is a reason, well, multiple reasons why you don't see, at least why you're not aware of a lot of serial killers, like the Ed Geins, the Ted Bundys, the, like, so many more people. And it seemed like they were all during that time, and several were going on at the same time. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. Number one, we have social media now. We have Simply Safe. We have Nest. We have all of these different doorbells. We have a lot more awareness and a lot more things now that would not prevent, because you're never going to prevent something like that. There's never going to be a scenario where people aren't killing people. And I'm sorry, but that's a fact. That's not an opinion. That is a fact, because you can't contain that, and you can't make people like go get help or whatever you want to call it. You just can't do that. So when I watch it, and this is certainly not the first time, like I said, I've studied serial killers, why the brain does the way we do, nature versus nurture, all of those things. That's the most beautiful part about a lot of the work that I've done, like just the educational piece of educating myself on nature versus nurture, why we respond to things, human behavior. And when, I guess in a way, I kind of know a lot about it, to where nothing really phases me about what people do. I don't take on their actions, and I don't take on their stuff, because I know that there's something going on there, right? And so I think it's a little bit different, because after a while you do get desensitized to it. I'm going to be honest. When you start to understand things and why people do, it's sad, but you do get desensitized to it. I'm assuming it's very similar to like a surgeon. And if they do everything they can and they lose a patient, I'm sure the first few times, I'm sure it's always going to be hard, but they can't carry that home. They can't be like, for the next week and a half, oh my God, what did I do? I mean, you just can't do that, right? And so there comes a level of desensitization. So if you're asking, why are some people created? So like, there's some like communicational thoughts on like, well, mom did a lot of different medications, different like prescribed drugs, and he had some surgery at like four or so, and they think the anesthesia could have done it. Sure, all of those things could be a thing. I will tell you, and I think I talked to you about concussions before, and I'm not saying he had one, but this is just a side note. If you have a CTE or a TBI, right, a traumatic brain injury, it can like trigger something in there. It really can. That doesn't mean, again, you've had a head trauma and all of a sudden you're going to be a serial killer. It's not at all what that means. I'm just telling you, it can exacerbate depression. It can exacerbate anxiety. So when I'm watching the show, and like I said, Evan Peters did the thing. Like, he really killed the game. Love it. Love him. Loved him on American Horror Story. I love it. And so people go, well, in that dark phase, like if you look at like Joaquin Phoenix and other people who do these dark roles, yeah, sometimes they have to decompress from it because you have to allow yourself to go to a dark space. And here's where a lot of people struggle. A lot of people have thoughts like that. I'm not saying that they engage in them, but a lot of people do. This does not mean that you're going to be a serial killer. So I think when people say, well, how hard is it to go into that? I think you have to be willing to be vulnerable and understand that you can still maintain some level of like reality. So anyway, that's about that. But as far as Jeffrey himself, I do know that they had his brain out for like a brief period of time. But as far as I know, that the brain was destroyed because much like everybody, we would all want to take a look at it, go deeper, look and see what's happening. Did something, was it nature? Was it nurture? Was it a combination of things? So if you're asking, first of all, I recommend watching it. Now, to be fair, I don't get grossed out by stuff. I don't take on other people's stuff. The victims themselves, if you're looking at the situation where the police returned the one gentleman back to him, yes, the ball was dropped, and it's an unfortunate thing, but the reality is, and while it is a lot different, it's still not all the way gone, because there was a homophobic version to it from these police officers, in my opinion, and I think it's described and seen just in writings, not just in the show, that you can tell that a lot of people didn't give it a lot of credence. And I feel like we still see that, and that's conversations people don't like to have. They don't like to have race relations conversations. They don't like to have, it's not an opinion. I mean, it's a fact. Like, I didn't make that up. Like, this is what happened. Right? The police were like, they made comments, it's on the record. So you have to realize what we're dealing with here. So do I personally believe, just knowing what I know, which is pretty much as you guys know, but I've also heard the tapes long before they've been coming out, which I think they come out like next week or so. So I've heard them. They're public, they're not private. But just in studying serial killers in general, there's a way that you have to understand that sometimes things are preventable. They really are. And if you're asking, do I think that a lot of these murders could have been prevented? I do. Do I think that we still drop the ball in many areas? I do. Racially, even from what people believe spiritually, even if you have different belief systems. So yeah, I do. But if you ask, what do I think about it? I think it's a very good show. I realize that a lot of the victims' families are struggling with that. And again, I told you I was going to address that. And I think because it's so like out there right now and it's like all over everything, it can be re-traumatizing. However, okay, and it's not to negate their feelings, but again, this is all public knowledge and it's been out there before, books, movies, things like that. So yes, I think that they have some things that they have to work on and just kind of work through it. But if you're asking about Jeffrey in general, I would have diagnosed him with a few things. I don't know that I would have diagnosed him with antisocial, for sure borderline, but every borderline person is not a murderer. I also think that there's a level of like schizoid personality in there. And I think there's just so much that comes with it, disassociation, various things like that. Again, I'm not diagnosing, I'm looking at it from the outside, but with some knowledge on what those things may look like if presented out. So what can you do? Can you prevent yourself from being murdered by a serial killer? Not really. I mean, yes, you can lock your doors, you can keep your head on a swivel. What you don't do is go into panic mode and go, I'm never leaving the house. I'm petrified to do everything. You have to live your life. If we have learned nothing in the last X amount of years, you can't do anything without a risk. You can't go to church, you can get gunned down there. Can't go to a grocery store, you can get gunned down there. You can't walk down the street, you can get gunned down. If you live your life in chronic fear, and they say one in like everybody will see somebody or meet somebody who's done like a killing or something. Like there's a lot that comes with that. Like, you don't know your neighbor. You think you do, you don't, right? Like, you know them enough. But if you walk around constantly in paranoia and fear of like, what if this happens to you? Sure, you don't want to just throw yourself out there in the mix of nothing. I mean, of like with no like repercussions or precautions. But You cannot live your life on hold, whether it be the pandemic, whether it be worrying if you're going to get shot, those things could happen. They could happen right now while I'm talking to you. A sniper could like shoot me right here while I'm talking to you. I can't worry about that in fear. So that's a little something for you to take, because you know what? Just because somebody is having an intrusive thought doesn't mean that they're going to be a murderer. Just because somebody seems like they have it together doesn't mean they do. So don't sit in judgment of others because you don't know what they're going through. But as far as the Jeffrey Dahmer show on Netflix, yeah, I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it. I thoroughly enjoyed the in depthness of it, and of course, some things were embellished because hello, welcome to the world. So some things were embellished, but you know, like Niecy, I say Niecy, Glinda, I think was her name in there. She didn't even live in the building, but it's good for the show, right? But seriously, she was still part of it. So, but yeah, that's my spin on the Jeffrey Dahmer and just people in general. You can't live your life in fear, because you know what? Don't tell me either what you won't do. I've been in this world long enough to know. Don't tell me what you won't do, because you just don't know.